Bill Ferris is a native Mississippian. He grew up in Warren County near Vicksburg and knows that terrain quite well. He studied at Davidson College in North Carolina, keeping his southern roots intact, before he left for Dublin, Ireland, which is quite a land of folklore itself, and finally came back to the United States to get his PhD in folklore at the University of Pennsylvania. He's now on the faculty at Yale as a professor of folklore. Bill, this word folklore, it's been widely interpreted and very narrowly interpreted. What does it mean to you?
Well, usually we talk about folklore and define it as oral tradition, which is passed on often from generation to generation. Basically, it's the spoken word and all that implies.
Does it mean just tales, stories?
No,
wider?
It covers a pretty broad range of things. It includes the folk tale, it includes the music, the blues, the spirituals, fiddling, gospel music. It includes a large number of crafts and folk architecture, which although they're obviously not oral, the skills are passed on from generation to generation. And in looking at folklore in a traditional way, we look at what we might call a master craftsperson, a man or a woman who has a special ability and a special skill, a special gift for quilting or telling stories. And these people are all part of a tradition. Here in Mississippi, for example, these traditions are Afro-American, Anglo-American, and others. And when we look at folklore, we look in some sense at an extension of history which is living today.
Right. Well, so much of Mississippi, well, all of Mississippi is folklore bound. I mean, we're just permeated with it. Why do you suppose there's not been any formal organization or historical documentation of folklore in Mississippi prior to the work you're doing, except, of course, for isolated instances that we know about?
Well, I guess in some sense it's been too close to us. It's too familiar. And I know often when I tell my family and when I tell the people with whom I grew up what I'm doing, they said, "You mean you're teaching that?" They say, "Well, that's as common as weeds around here. It grows wild." And that's true. And if we look at the history of folklore study in Mississippi, and there has been a lot of scholarship that was done on Mississippi, most of it is by other scholars from outside the state, such as Alan Lomax, for example, one of the key people in American folklore. He and his father, John, traveled throughout the state, and hundreds of recordings of Mississippi singers are in the archives at the Library of Congress today.
And they're constantly pulling them out and
Right.
rediscovering them.
Right.
Which is valuable. I think the thing that matters most to me about your work, aside from preserving these traditions and identifying, is that you're making us more aware of the worth of these things. You're sharpening our sensibilities to what we have right in our backyards, as you pointed out. And I know this process could possibly occur on its own over a long period of time. For instance, we have in the archives early guidebooks to Mississippi written right after we became a state, say 1820 or 1830, and these very esoteric, cultured Englishmen would come down and they would describe log houses with great distaste. They would say, really ugly structures, you know, that were just appalled. But I doubt if you could find a single person in Mississippi today that does not respond favorably to a log house. It has developed in our sensibility as a beautiful object now. And I suppose in 150 years, a lot of the things we are finding through your eyes might be beautiful, but thank you for doing it right here and now to make us aware of them while we're here. And
well, I think it's unfair to say that it's because of work I've done. It's not. There is a tradition of Southerners looking at their own culture and at their own place, their own region. We can look, for example, at James Agee, whose home was in Knoxville, Tennessee. A.G. came back to the South and looked in a classic study at rural sharecroppers in Alabama in Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. And about the same period, Eudora Welty was traveling around the state. And when I first began my work, I remember visiting the archives here, and the director at that time, who was Charlotte Capers, showed me the early photographs that Eudora Welty had taken of the places, the homes of rural Mississippi. I remember very clearly that the faces that she had worked with and those of Walker Evans and James Agee were sort of lingering in the back of my head as a sort of guide as to what was important and what had been neglected. In the South, we are often very sensitive and very aware of the more affluent part of our past, the antebellum mansions, the image of Gone with the Wind. But we have an equally important and an equally impressive tradition of folk culture. And I really think that Southerners, black and white, have appreciated this. And the work of Miss Welty, for example, is a good example of that.
It's hard to get an absolute definition of folk as differentiated from popular culture. And sometimes there's some overlapping, but could you go with that for a minute?
Sure. We can't be absolutely clear in making a distinction as to what is and is not folk. But usually the way I try to conceptualize it is to look at the human experience, whether one grows up in suburban America or in rural Mississippi, wherever. Each of us is, we might say, part of a whole, a three-part whole. The first part is the literary tradition, the written word, the body of learning that's symbolized by the library and the books that are in there. This is part of the tradition that we are taught is the way of learning. Now, the second level of our experience is popular culture, the culture created by electricity. The television sets, which are projecting our image right now, are part of this. The record player, the radio. These are projecting images of our culture and of ourselves, which are popular in the sense that they represent a common denominator. We watch the national news, everyone sees and responds to those accounts. So this is something that Americans share as a whole. We began with the academic tradition, then the popular tradition of culture, and finally the folk tradition, which is the oral or the spoken part of our culture. And in varying degrees, we all participate in each. Whether one is a Shakespearean scholar at Harvard or a folk singer in Tupelo, each of us reads, each of us watches television, and each of us is aware of stories, of jokes, and of music. And a sort of extension of this is the misconception that as one leaves a folk culture in a classic sense, as one leaves a rural community and is educated, becomes affluent, one becomes less oriented towards folklore. Nothing could be further from the truth. And when we look at academics, for example, they're highly superstitious people, just as their students are. And before an exam, students have a whole ritual of behavior to sort of assure that they're going to do well. Athletes are terrifically superstitious. If they're in a winning streak, they do certain things.
And that's all folklore?
This is all folk culture. And I guess to sort of come back to the original question, folklore is a part of each of us. It's the tales, the stories, the oral culture, which is part of everyone's human experience. It's part of that. Two other parts are popular culture, the things we learn through the television and the radio, and the academic culture, the things which are transferred in print. And as a folklorist, we have to realize that we never deal with only one, that there's a dynamic between the three levels.
You've met a lot of bearers of folk tradition here in the state, and these are the people that really fascinate me because, as you say, they're totally exposed to the popular culture. It's not as if they were isolated and doing only the things they know how to do. They have chosen to stick with that tradition of doing things. Do you think that's a moral decision? Do you think it's an aesthetic thing? How do you think this generally comes about in a person's soul?
I think it's a cultural thing. I think that human experience is a culture, and one is born into culture. We're Americans, all of us, and we share certain patterns, certain responses. Within America, we have regional culture. We are Southerners. We're different from New Englanders. We're different from Westerners. We share a culture there. As Mississippians, we share an even more defined culture. And within Mississippi, I think, the folk, as opposed to non-folk groups, have a culture which is more or less a defining way of developing personality. And when we talk about the folk way of doing things, they will tend to do things in similar ways. For example, if we look at the whole issue of recycling, the ecologists have raised recently, the folk have been doing this for a long time. Now, in middle-class America, when you wear out your washing machine, when you wear out your clothes, or when you get tired of a certain style of drapery, you take those and throw them away, and that becomes trash. Within the folk culture, there's no such thing as trash. Nothing is ever used up. Those garments are recycled as quilts. An old washing machine may be taken apart and used as a tremendous flower pot. We'll see later tires which have been used as flower pots. And this is part of folk culture. And given a set of problems, such as what do we do with this old washing machine that no longer works? Well, in folk culture, that answer is, let's use it. It's no longer a washing machine, but maybe there's something in that structure that can be reused in a different way. If it's not going to be reused right away, we'll put it over here and wait until we need it.
Yeah.
And
the original ecologists. Do you think there are materials that are in use today that we do not now recognize as folk, that 100 years from now may be thought of as folk?
Well, I'm sure that we never can fully appreciate the dynamics of what are going on and the sort of creations within the folk community. And the history of folklore scholarship and collecting is a history of things missed. For example, Cecil Sharp, and one can look at this as if we were looking with blinders. We see only those things we've been trained to see. Cecil Sharp, a famous ballad scholar, went into Appalachia to collect the ballad, and in his terms, he defined the ballad as the child ballad, a classic canon collection of Francis James Child. Well, most of the ballads he encountered were about mining. They were Native American ballads and not the European English ballad that he was looking for. So what he would do is have a singer tell his whole repertoire and perform. And occasionally a child ballad would come up and he would turn on the machine and record it. When we look back 50 years from now, we'll say, well, why didn't you film that? Or why didn't you record that? It was right there and you missed it. We'll say, well, gosh, you know, I didn't realize that was important. I thought that this was what folklore was about. So there will be things, I'm sure 50 years from now, we'll really regret not having done.
I've been traveling around South Mississippi looking for folk structures. And of course I'm looking for log barns and things that we now recognize as folk materials. But I keep seeing those cement block houses and churches, and I think, that really may qualify as a folk material because it's available, it's easy to work with, and it's what they go out and get and build the houses with now, when they're doing it on their own. And maybe that's the folk material of the future.
This is true. And I think that some people are sensitive to this. Henry Glassy, for example, who's done a lot of work with folk architecture, talks about the folk who live in the log cabin, the classic James Agee situation, or Eudora Welty. Well, where are those people today? Those cabins are deserted. You mentioned earlier that many of the ones you saw were no longer inhabited. Those people are living in other structures. Perhaps it's a trailer, perhaps it's cinder blocks. And what are they doing in those homes? How are they dealing with their environment? What are they putting on the wall? The photographs that Agee photographed on the wall are in a trailer now, perhaps. And it takes a tremendous amount of conviction and belief that you are doing what is important to go out and study a trailer community when you've been taught that, well, folklore is off in the backwoods somewhere.
That's right. Well, speaking of going out and studying, let's see what's come of some of your travels around Mississippi, and tell us what you've been doing in the state.
Well, I guess when one comes into Mississippi, the first thing we see is the definition of the state as a sense of place, the river, which defines it on the western side. And as we move down the rural roads, we come into communities and have a tremendous sense of the isolation and the sense of place, the region, which is reflected in the music and the tales, the crossroads communities, the country stores, where the folk tradition has centered, the local philosophers and singers often gathered and gossiped. And we see also the folk architecture, such as the dog trot house, homes that are built by local builders and decorated with gardens that are often using the recycled tires as flower pots. And we become aware that there is an aesthetic at work. There's a sense of beauty that we have not fully appreciated. Recycling of bottles, for example, in this bottle tree as a decoration. And we begin to look at the faces of the folk artists, and in speaking with them try to understand that their creations reflect their family, their friends, and the issues which they feel are important. The sense of beauty of the folk is different from that which we've been trained. The folk tale performers, such as the mule trader Ray Lum, who traded livestock and mules throughout the South, was basically doing what was a critical part of the Southern economy, providing horses and mules that tilled the soil and provided transportation in the rural areas. The faces of artists such as A.B. Mahan here in Mississippi and that of Amanda Gordon reflect a tremendous sense of individuality and the whole world of the rural South. It was out of this root that folk tradition developed, the music singing about the cotton fields. And we begin to look in depth at the truly great men of our culture and great women, as James Agee said, are those who are creating out of necessity, out of the simple things of life, simple things such as the quilt. And today, happily, there's a renewed interest and sense of the quilt as an art form which should be considered as important as those artists we've looked at for so long, the Picassos and Rembrandts of history, are paralleled by a folk context, a folk aesthetic. And we have to look not only at the objects but at the people. We have to talk with them, and they must be recognized as the experts. The teacher of folklore is simply a vessel, and it's through him or her that one begins to hear the voices of the folk. Through the recording, through the photograph, through the film, one moves into the community and sees the power of the human voice, the power of the human creative spirit that prevails over all of the problems that one finds in rural life or in folk life in general. And one sees emerging a new vision of beauty, and in many ways a vision which complements the art, the music, the history that we have been studying for so long in our universities. So I think that in looking at these objects and in looking at the people who create them, we're beginning to open a whole new door, a whole new way of understanding our culture as Americans and as regional Americans.
Bill, you have organized the Center for Southern Folklore. Could you tell us about some of the work the center is doing?
Yes, in my own work I have felt that in looking at folklore it's essential to try to develop as many forms of media as possible. And at the center we're looking at a number of folk traditions in the South and are developing a combination of studies which include a documentary film, a record, and a book. And it is my feeling that each of these in a different way is a complementary way of studying. In the film we have a sense of the action and the movement of the people. On the record we have an extended opportunity to listen to the tales, and in the book we have a source of information that allows a researcher to go into more depth with the same tradition, so that when studying folklore, if one has all three, hopefully we can truly appreciate the full richness of each person and each tradition.
Well, you're a multimedia operation, and you're certainly a multi-layered discoverer, because blues, crafts, architecture, folk tales, the people that you found have just been exciting and valuable. And I hope your work will go on and others will take it up. I think folklore is having a tremendous revival, certainly in Mississippi, and I think all over the nation. It's taken off, as they say.
Thank you.
What are your immediate plans?
Well, our immediate plans are two-part. First, to finish the numerous projects we have in progress already. We have done a number of films on a Mississippi mule trader, Mr. Ray Lum, on blues, on fiddling, and other traditions. And what we're trying to do is to complete the books and the records which will accompany each of those films. Beyond that, we will be developing a feature film on several other Mississippi traditions, as well as an index of all available folklore films in the country, so that the instructor who wants to deal with the craft, for example, or perhaps with basket making, can locate these tremendously scattered examples of film, and it hopefully will encourage people to deal seriously with folklore.
The thing that's amazed me about your work so far that I've seen is that you can take a camera into a situation and the people apparently feel so comfortable with it that there's no intrusion, and it's really like being there with them. I compliment that ease that you apparently can move with a camera in front of your eye. It's quite difficult to do, I know.
Well, there's a filmmaker named Les Blank who's done lovely films on the Louisiana Cajuns, the French black-speaking culture there, and on bluesmen in Texas. And he made the statement that he can make his camera disappear. He can make it invisible. And I really feel that in working closely with a tradition, we sort of enter the skull, enter the flesh of the person or group with whom we work. And at that point, one uses the camera as an extension of your own experience. And it's there, but it's not really felt as an intrusion. And,
well, I can see how you can psych yourself up to feel that way, but it's amazing to me that the people with whom you're talking can completely forget the camera's there, apparently, particularly in very personal, private things like religious services, or as in the case of James' son Thomas' film, in private parties in their home. It really is just beautifully intimate, and I think it's a touch hard to come by.
I'm not sure that I deserve very much credit for that, because when one goes to those situations and feels the drama, for example, of a rural church service or of a blues dance, the music and the power of the storyteller, for example, is so dramatic that a camera may be noticed for a while, but it's much more interesting to hear the speaker or to listen to the music. And I've always felt that that the camera can only be an intrusion for a short time when one is dealing with a folk drama that's so powerful and so much more exciting.
Yeah, and that they are concentrated on.
So I don't think it's completely a credit to me if those situations seem relaxed. I think it's more credit to the folklore and its own drama.
Well, it's not a technique, in other words, it just happens. Well, another spin-off is you're making folk heroes out of people. Ray Lum, he's a big Mississippi folk hero now, and quite a charming man. This
is really the nicest part of folklore. I think that one, it's almost unfair that one is teaching and studying individuals who are so much fun to work with, and I say that in a very positive way. I feel that I grow and I have learned through what are friendships and very deep relationships with people, and my work is based on that, so that when I develop films or am doing writing, I'm dealing with people that I love, and I'm sort of trying to share that love with those who are interested in folklore. And to me, it's been very, very rewarding to see James Thomas, for example, whom I met as a Delta blues singer who was completely unappreciated even in his own community, and now he's singing at Yale and at Indiana University.
A folk hero, that's true.
Yeah.